No, but for him, the podium is set up, but you want a hand up. Okay. All right. Are you ready? Cool. Okay, you ready? Okay. Welcome, welcome to another Wednesday with faculty. How are y'all doing this morning? Wait, afternoon. If it's noon, is it afternoon? If it's 12 o'clock, it's still, yeah, so 12:01, afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm so excited for another Wednesdays with faculty. I always thank Dr. Carr for suggesting it and planning it and getting it all together. So thank you, Dr. Carr, for doing that. And we're starting right out with Dr. T.A.J., Taj Mahal, as I call him.
Thank you, Dean Montes. Good afternoon now. I think I can safely say that. It is good to see you all, and I am glad to be here to present my brother beloved and to get out of the way. It is my honor to present this afternoon Dr. Myron Krys Florence, who is in his second year as a visiting professor of pastoral theology here at Union. He is a native of Decatur, Georgia, and he has received his PhD in pastoral theology, personality, and culture on the clinical track from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. If you have ever had the gift of hearing him sing, it should be no surprise then to know that he has served as a worship leader for various churches and denominations. And if you have not had that gift, make sure you lean on Dean Montes and make sure that he comes back to share that part of his many giftings. He is also a practicing psychotherapist where his clinical work centers the experiences of queer, trans, and poly relationships and individuals. If I were at church, I'd say something like, but all you really need to know is that he loves the Lord and he loves people, or some other kind of rhetorical flourish to underscore that he is an incredible and genuine person. But since I'm here, I'll say that to know him is to be cared for, and that though he is not my therapist, I can imagine the attention and care that he must offer his clients. Myron Krys has a presence that is calming and loving, and I know that that emerges from an incredible heart and passion for people. And so I'm excited, and hope you are excited as well, in welcoming him here today to speak about the idea of anti-black worship. So do me a favor, put your hands together and welcome Dr. Myron Krys.
So good to be here with you all, to be in this space. And as I was preparing at 4 a.m. this morning, I was like, what am I doing? And why am I doing this? It reminded me of a day back when I was pastoring, and every Sunday I was having to do something like this. But I'm a little rusty. I haven't done this in a while. So it usually didn't take that long. But every Sunday, my mother and I drove 60 miles or an hour and a half on Highway 85 South to Woodbury, Georgia, for church. Every May, we would drive through Gay, Georgia, where they would have the cotton picking fair, which my mother informed me they still have today. We never stopped, but we slowed down as we drove past to watch out for pedestrians. Every year, we saw vendors out selling the stereotyped mammy dolls and the tar babies, as we call them. Pitch black dolls with overly exaggerated white bug eyes and watermelon sliced lips. As we drove through little country towns, we saw rusted metal shotgun houses, one-room houses that looked like they were remnants from slavery times. The smoke coming from the chimneys informed us that they were not just relics of a distant past, but functional inhabitations. Many educated black city folks, like my mom and me, came from miles around because a church alive is worth the drive. Yet driving from Metro Atlanta, it was as if we were being transported back in history to a little town with one street light. Every Sunday we drove up to this white church building that sat on a hill, and our black bodies entered. Sister Parks, we called everybody brother or sister, would open up the service by inviting everyone to leave their stuff, leave from their resting place in the pews, and gather around the altar as we sang, "We have come into this house, gather in his name to worship him. We have come into this house, gather in his name to worship him. We have come into this house, gather in his name to worship Christ the Lord. Worship him, Christ the Lord." We sang that a couple times, and then we would go into the second verse, which says, "So forget about yourself, concentrate on him and worship him. So forget about yourselves, concentrate on him and worship him. So forget about yourselves, concentrate on him and worship Christ the Lord. Worship him, Christ the Lord." We came to worship God, which inextricably meant to forget about ourselves. But within our uncritical theologies, we were not only forgetting about ourselves, but focusing on and glorifying whiteness. Within today's conversation starter, I will grapple with the ways that some Christian worship songs unconsciously perpetuate anti-blackness. Here I speak specifically to the messaging found in the lyrics alone, what I call lyrical theologies. Notably, within Black church worship experiences, these lyrical theologies do not stand alone, but are surrounded by community preaching and other worship elements. Yet here, I isolate the lyrics, taking them at face value, allowing them to speak on their own terms, so that we can examine the psychological functioning of the musical text. In so doing, it is my intention to lift Black gospel music worship lyrics as elements worthy of psychological and theological analysis. Throughout my phenomenological and scholarly research, I have often found that when worship songs, specifically Black gospel music in general, are used within academia and ecclesial Black spaces, they are tools to highlight points, but are rarely, if ever, critically deconstructed from a psychological perspective. Today's talk is a movement in that direction. During our time together, our brief time together, I might add, I will make the argument that Black worship lyrics unconsciously perpetuate anti-Blackness by exacerbating internalized Black inferiority, promoting white supremacy, and encouraging our dissociation from our lived experience, thereby hijacking us from our embodied fight in our own social liberation. I use the terms worship to encapsulate the songs incorporated into the service. I also make the underlying claim that what worship is has evolved over time within the Black church experience, becoming whitewashed. As a disclaimer, I broach this topic with a healthy sense of critique, but also in love, having been a praise and worship leader for most of my life. Yet in my faith tradition, we never challenged the music that we sang. which was echoed through the voices of many other Black worship leaders that I have interviewed over the years. Thus, this is an open invitation to critically engage the words we sing from a social justice-oriented lens. So let's go. Anti-blackness. What does it mean to be anti-Black? In the 2016 article, Be Real Black for Me, Imagining Black Crit in Education, Michael J. Dumas and Kahani Mariah Ross state that anti-Blackness is a social construction where Black is despised thing in itself, but not persons for her or himself, in opposition to all that is pure, human or humane, and white. Within this construct, Black people are devalued, marginalized, and minimized, preventing our full participation in society. Further, anti-Blackness constructs Black subjects and positions us in and against law, policy, and even everyday civic life. In other words, to be Black from an anti-Black lens means to be criminalized and homogenized by the minimalization of Black persons to just a race, while other groups are afforded a more detailed, nuanced, and embodied theorization of their lived racialized conditions. In the 1903 text, The Souls of Black Folk, W.E.B. Du Bois asks the iconic and legendary question, how does it feel to be a problem? He argues to white America that he is not a problem, nor is the Negro a problem. The problem is the perception and treatment of the Negro as inferior based on the color of skin. I argue today, even within all Black spaces, our sung theologies are antithetical to Du Bois' argument. Anti-Black worship exacerbates internalized Black inferiority. Every Sunday in my Pentecostal non-denominational church, we would come to the front of the church during the altar call, where we would surrender our Blackness to God, pleading for God to remove it from us. Here, Blackness was synonymous with being filthy, dirty, sinful. It emboldened the embedded belief that I am intrinsically wrong and there is no goodness in me. Every Sunday we sang the lyrics of the artist formerly known as Toney as he sang, "Lord, make me over. Lord, make me over. Lord, make me over. Make me over again. There is no good thing in me, so Lord, make me over. Lord, make me over. Lord, make me over. Make me over again." We sang it so many times that even if you did not want to internalize it, you could not resist. As a worship leader, if congregations did not feel the weight of unworthiness and inferiority, if they were not crying out to God in repentance for being so unclean, we didn't do our job right. This programming of Black bodies being dirty or unclean in the face of society that already devalues Blackness has psychological effects. Austrian psychotherapist Alfred Adler theorized that what he called the inferiority complex. According to Adlerian psychology, feelings of inferiority cause one to be maladaptive in the face of challenges, preventing a person from using creativity to come up with solutions to problems. It places the focus more on one's appearance than the demands of life. Further, the ability to survive and flourish is greatly impaired. In the face of an inferiority complex, people intrinsically lean into overcompensation as they work to be good enough. Within my clinical practice, I often have to help clients with feelings of inferiority and low self-esteem from religious trauma unpack and release the internalized inferiority complex that was so indoctrinated into their psyche that they cannot see themselves in any other way. Similarly, in Adlerian's theory, individuals work to overcome feelings of inferiority and to act in ways that benefit the social interest. However, in particular Black faith traditions, they sang songs like, "I'm just a nobody, trying to tell everybody about somebody who can save anybody. I'm a nobody. I am nothing." This theology is antithetical to Black liberation. For you see, even in the 1960s and 70s, the civil rights leader Jesse Jackson charged Black folks to repeat after him. He would say, "I may be poor, I may be Black, but I am somebody." So then, what do we do with a sung theology that at its core perpetuates that I am nothing, I am nobody, I am less than? The only goodness that can come out of me is my allegiance and devotion to whiteness. Whiteness does not have to oppress us if we perpetuate lyrical theologies where we oppress ourselves. As already alluded to, anti-Black worship promotes white supremacy. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain. He washed me white as snow. He washed me white as snow. He washed me white as snow. To be holy, to be pleasing unto God entailed being white. Just as Blackness is a social construct, whiteness is also a construct that was created in the mid-1600s. People and bodies are not born white, they are made white. I will say that again. People and bodies are not born white, they are made white. Throughout history, groups were slowly engrafted into whiteness as, for example, Irish people became white, and Jewish people became white, and so many others. Many years ago, a Puerto Rican friend and scholar told me that technically she is supposed to check the white box for race under the US Census. Over time, many have been subsumed into the exclusive club of whiteness, making whiteness synonymous with particular non-Black bodies. Recent 2023 studies assert that still today, lighter skin is linked to beauty and status, attractiveness and opportunity. The closer to white a person is, the smaller the Black-white disparities in the color gap. In other words, the lighter the Black skin, the fewer barriers to wealth attainment. In her essay, Whiteness as Property, Cheryl Harris argues that whiteness was first constructed to secure for whites specific entitlement to domination over Black and indigenous peoples, and then, after the end of formal racial segregation, continued to preserve for whites certain benefits of social status, material resources, and political power. Thus, by design, whiteness eventually became synonymous with power and privilege. To be Black meant to be powerless. Dumas and Ross continues that thought process articulating whiteness then as a form of entitlement, a birthright that can be enjoyed and repeatedly cashed in, becomes important as a possession of poor whites who will never have much actual cash. Therefore, it is okay to be poor as long as you are white. At least I'm not black. Whiteness gives one a hand up as poor engrafted whites can imagine themselves as worth more than and superior to black bodies. Therein, anti-blackness is central to the domination of white supremacy. The prophet James Baldwin said, "The reason people think it's important to be white is that they think it's important not to be black." Finally, anti-black worship promotes the dissociation from our lived experience, thereby hijacking us from our embodied fight in our own social liberation. Black worship arguably came out of the lineage of the Negro spirituals of the 17th and through the 19th centuries. In a brief sweeping overview, these spirituals were rooted in the belief that God brought us through so much already. We can be sure God will continue to do so. White enslavers eventually permitted enslaved persons to be saved or Christianized. But they made a drastic distinction between that of the body and the soul. For them, salvation was a tool of oppression, as oppressors used scripture to encourage slaves to obey your masters, Ephesians 6:1. Yet in spite of these negative messages, blacks used spirituals as social commentary, serving as ways to convey their deepest feelings about their predicaments. Yet these songs did not stop there. They also held political and liberatory undertones, as they used such songs as "Follow the drinking gourd, follow the drinking gourd, for the old man is waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd." This song and so many others like it told those trying to escape how to get away by following the Big Dipper in the sky. Although not defined as such, these Negro spirituals were worship of a black God who fought for the liberation of the oppressed, as theologian James Cone would contend. As time progressed, the genre of black gospel music was birthed. Often contributed to Thomas Dorsey, using him as its progenitor, his song spoke of the anxieties, joys, and aspirations of the poor, the rejected, and often uneducated African American population. Eventually, black gospel fed into the freedom songs of the American civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. This movement was a singing movement, as the songs expressed the aspirations of struggle for equality and justice. Arguably, black worship up to this point encompassed a liberating and an embodied undertone. But then came the genre of praise and worship. I remember within my lifetime when we moved from the time of devotion to a time of praise and worship. Devotional and gospel songs had a simplistic and a rhythmic and repetitive nature to them. As a child during devotion, we would sing one chorus literally for an hour. Yet praise and worship seems to be more sophisticated and more white. I recall hearing the Maranatha singers and all their words, they had so many words. Their website states that they began in 1971 under the direction of Chuck Smith Jr. But praise and worship theology, however, originally emerged in the 1890s with the Latter Rain Revival movement. It later was popularized by American, European, and Pentecostal preacher Reg Lasell. In 1946, Lasell had the idea that praise and worship was a biblical theology, unlike the perceptions of the songs sung by blacks. He expressed that God inhabits the praises of God's people. His theology removed the recognition of human suffering and traded it in, putting all the focus on heaven and the divine. As this theology found its way into the Black church experience, we began to direct our attention away from the realities of and the liberation from our human condition, and instead viewed worship as purely otherworldly. In other words, it invited us to dissociate or feel detached from our environments, our communities, and our own bodies. Psychologically and somatically speaking, dissociation paralyzes us, fostering inactivity. When one dissociates, they feel unsafe. In the fight, flight, freeze paradigm, they freeze. Furthermore, they experience both feelings of uncertainty about who they are and little to no physical pain. It is the way that the mind copes with too much stress. Working with clients who often dissociate, the psychological fix is to help them to feel safe and bring them back into their bodies. This might include helping them to notice their breathing without judging it, paying attention to the 5 senses. What do you see, hear, taste, smell, feel? And even tapping exercises. From a clinical perspective, dissociation is not the goal, but a symptom of trauma. Yet anti-Black worship leans into dissociation opposed to pressing through it. Although people challenged the Negro spirituals claiming that they were too otherworldly, worship songs, I argue, are far more problematic. But you see, the spirituals had a motion and an embodied justice-centric movement to them that extended beyond the walls of a building. It was a movement that compelled people to do more than raise their hands and sway in the spirit, but to position their bodies in subversive ways that ultimately were meant to get one closer to a physical freedom, regardless if that freedom was ever materialized. Engaging worship and the divine worked in tandem with Black liberation. Yet worship music of today does not lift up and liberate the Black, but seeks to reinforce its inferiority. Anti-Blackness builds on the dehumanization and erasure of Black bodies. I argue that anti-Black worship, or Black worship in its current iteration, does just that. By encouraging us to dissociate from our bodies and our lived experiences. It decenters the Black experience, which, as historically seen, is antithetical to Black liberation. So in conclusion, within this talk today, my ultimate goal has been to invite us to critically think about the ways that Christian worship functions in the fight for social justice. Does worship only entail coming into a building, closing our eyes, lifting our hands, and going into a dissociated state? Or should it do something more? As I have sought to convey, Black liberation from the first captured Africans to place foot on American soil until today has always come at the hands of people who have incorporated their bodies into the act of liberation by physically using their faith and their lyrical theologies to fight against systems of oppression. Yet praise and worship theology directs our focus away from our own experience, and in so doing causes us to not actively fight for our own liberation. If our total purpose in Black churches are to worship God, and worshiping God means forgetting about ourselves and our human condition, dissociation, then when will we ever fight against the lived injustices that we endure on a daily basis? Worship easily becomes a pacifier as we wait for a holy other or a savior outside of ourselves to come and save the day. This is even further expounded when we think about anti-black worship. David Kirkland, a transdisciplinary scholar of language, literacy, and urban education, poses the question, in what ways can you do blackness well in which it aids black freedom? In the film Black is Beautiful, historian Tricia Rose says the Black is Beautiful movement in the 1960s and 70s was, quote, an effort to throw off the shackles of the way white supremacists constructed black bodies. They are not as intelligent. They are not human. They are not as beautiful. They are not valued. So to undo that, one has to directly attack that ideology, end quote. Within my continuous research, I have interviewed numerous black worship leaders, particularly those that are seminary trained. They all pointed to the fact that in their youth, they sang songs but never critically engaged hymnody and Christian lyricology with a hermeneutic of suspicion. One participant noted, "We can sing a lie just as fast as we can tell one." I believe that the lie that we sing is the unconscious bias that blackness is inferior, sinful, and impure, and needs to be purged from us and replaced with whiteness. Throughout United States history, recognition of the worth of black lives has been muted by institutionalized repression of the black. Our lyrical theologies should deconstruct and not reinforce this reality. Perhaps the answer lies in history. There is value in helping one cope with the societal pressures. Black church spaces have often been a place where parishioners can escape the white gaze. Understandably, we all need respite at times when we can just breathe. But that is not all that worship needs. As the Negro spirituals teach us, it is possible to sing songs that are otherworldly, but are inextricably coded with embodied instructions for black liberation. Yet many Christian songwriters, even within reformed and liberal spaces, continue to perpetuate anti-blackness. Thus, here today, this is a clarion call for all of us to do the difficult work of critically engaging our lyrical theologies to see how they may or may not be serving us well.
Wow. Any questions? Let's start with students, please.
So are there any initiatives happening anywhere to revisit some of these historic works and trying to find new ways to is there anything going on with trying to I don't know, you can't redeem them. So create new versions of things that are meant to be more liberative, or I mean, is there anything like that happening?
I do believe there are areas, particularly in more, I'll say, white or reformed spaces, where that is happening. But my argument is that in many black spaces, black church spaces, particularly spaces that are not to not have a pastor that's been theologically trained, it's not happening. Like the church that my mom goes to, you know, wonderful people, but I don't think they're doing this work. So that's part of the disconnect within even the Black church experience, that there's a disconnect from academia and their spaces. So the things that we take as, you know, we know these things here, it's not always translated there.
Thank you. Wow, that was so good. So thank you just for, first of all, invoking spirit and Black liberative sound into the space, and also kind of tussling with it. 2 questions. I'm wondering if you could speak to, because you did a couple different songs, and so one of them like explicitly references whiteness in the subtext, right? White as snow. But the Toe Neck song and some of the other songs don't necessarily, at least lyrically, associate whiteness as the goal, but godliness, right? So Toe Neck is like, Lord, make me over, make me over, make me over. And it does get into a theology of kind of this innate human inferiority unless we are more proximate to God. But I'm curious about, one, are you seeing in your research subtext, like very explicit subtext of approximating godliness to whiteness, or approximating godliness to just something that's different and more beyond human? And do you see that as a version of white supremacy at work? So I'm curious about that. And then secondly, the gospel music industry is so interesting to me because some of the biggest gospel artists are queer, but like can't be queer in public, including some of the songs that you even referenced, right? And some of the artists that you referenced. So I'm wondering too if you could speak to, just like the kind of role of homophobia within the Black music and Black gospel tradition, and how that also limits what artists can write about, sing about, and how they can kind of bring their whole personhood into their artistry.
So that second question is definitely the crux of a lot of my research. And again, I keep coming back to this separation, because even in being in the worship spaces around songwriters, they kind of glorify the fact that, you know, we are not, you know, those people that are trained. I'm just, you know, I have the true gospel, the true word that is untainted, that's not infiltrated by the academy, if I could say it that way. So there's kind of a glorification of that is, I think, does a disservice to people, because we're not able to hear the songs. For me, even personally, that's part of the issue and the things that I have with worship, even going into worship experiences, because the songs are there, and they, you know, musically they're on point. There's nothing secondary to gospel music. I'll just say it has a power to move and evoke you and push you. But when you think about the lyrics, I argue that it doesn't always liberate. So to go back to your second question, your first question, the move that I was trying to make there is to show that we are in environments where Blackness is demonized. And so in that type of society, in that type of environment, to sing theologies that continue to perpetuate that instead of resisting that is problematic. So that's the point of, like, when suppressing ourselves and making ourselves as inferior, then it serves as a tool for white supremacy.
I don't know if professor questions are allowed, but I want to jump in. I was a student at one point. I want to jump in though, because I want to continue to sort of press on that line, because my question is inferior to whom and anti-black to whom. Mm-hmm. So in the hymn, when we sing "Makes Me White as Snow," are you suggesting that the ingesting of that and the singing of that is sort of inherently anti-black? In other words, do you think Black people singing it are thinking that they are getting closer to whiteness, or do they recognize the rhetorical and kind of metaphorical purity that is in white snow? Mm-hmm. So my question is this a kind of external critique in a sort of way that others might view Blackness, or do you think that even in the language itself, it perpetuates, to use your language, a kind of unconscious a kind of unconscious self-hate, and depending on your answer, I have a response.
So, if you notice throughout this talk, I've intentionally kind of talked from the center of the Black church experience, like us. So I've invited all of you to the Black church experience. So for me, my work speaks to Black people, for Black people, in this instance. So the argument is that we believe that it is liberating us. But the psychotherapist in me does desire to kind of punch holes in that a little bit and see how might we unconsciously be perpetuating systems of whiteness. So it is more of that unconscious thing that I'm seeking to do here.
And so my pushback is, I certainly understand. I suppose rhetorically, though, my pushback, though, is I wonder if there's a way that we sometimes undercut the inherent creativity and hermeneutical aptitude of Black folk to be able to recognize something like "wash me white as snow" and like what it means ultimately. It reminds me of when I was in seminary and amongst Black fellow Black seminarians, we would often say, "Oh, all this stuff we're learning, this, we're not being homophobic anymore, and different ways of reading the Bible. Oh, I can't take that back home because they won't get that, they won't understand it." When I'm reminded of Thurman's grandmother, right, who had a complicated hermeneutic early on, right? Give me the Bible, don't give me Paul. So that's just my area of continued conversation. To what extent are folk doing a kind of interpretation even in the singing of said lyrics? And I think it's a bit of a both and, but I've had so many questions. I appreciate the way that you've enlivened and brought up these things. I'm so grateful.
And throughout my work, like I mentioned, being a conversation starter. So it's to kind of spark something in people to be able to continue the conversation, but it's definitely not the definitive end-all, be-all perspective, but kind of opening up those conversations about things, particularly my mom's church is using that example, they're not talking about. So to promote the conversations.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more, so I think this will be the last one. Because I'm not quite sure what time it is, but I was told 2 a second ago, and that we had you, so I think this is one.
This is a simple question, but maybe a complex answer. How do I imagine God as my father when I'm Black, when my skin is Black, and my lived experience is Black? And I imagine God as white, with male, with long blonde hair.
So state the question. So
how do I imagine God as father, my father, when physically, what I see, my lived experience is Black, and God, my image of God is white.
That's a whole nother conversation and a whole nother, I think that's again, really another talk to kind of, thank you, to get at some of that. But that is the challenge. I think that was James Cone's challenge, arguably, like to see God as Black, so then we can see ourselves in the a Black God, as opposed to seeing a white God who is not close to our experience. But that's an excellent question and definitely something to continue to tease through. Thank you all so much.